As we hurtle towards the release of the rebooted Resident Evil movies, Welcome to Raccoon City, what better way to take a casual look back on the 6 Paul W.S. Anderson films that preceded it? Not usually something we would cover in any great detail on the podcast, however there was an aspect I was keen to look further into. Now, the original Resident Evil movies have existed in their own timeline since the first film graced the cinemas back in 2002, earning a staggering $1.2 billion in the box office. The 6 subsequent films make the Resident Evil franchise the highest-grossing video game movie series of all time, showcasing the continuing adventures of Alice against the Umbrella Corporation. To date, the character of Alice has never appeared in any canon or even non-canonical Resident Evil entry, and for many fans that's the way it should be. Despite this glaring omission, the influence of the Anderson movies on the games is actually quite significant. I'm Nick, better known as Neptune from the Resident Evil podcast, and these are the biggest influences the live-action movies have had on Resident Evil. Perhaps one of the most striking influences can be seen in the North American box art for Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and Resident Evil Outbreak File 2. Unlike Europe, where the franchise has retained the famous red impact font for its box art, North America was far more liberal with theirs. And we see this in the Outbreak titles, taking the pointy font used in all 6 Anderson movies. Both games in this sub-franchise were adorned with this font, and whilst not a particularly unappealing one, their continued use in the films has meant that the Outbreaks, in North America at least, have stuck out against all other games. And a font change is not also exclusive to the box art, oh no. In Universe, we've seen a change to the insidious organisation Umbrella. Up until the first movie hit our screens, the Umbrella logo was consistently looking like this, with its beautiful italicised U. The movie added the word corporation, and in doing so we've seen a gradual shift in game to a font more recognisable with the ones we see in the films. Resident Evil games have a long history of offering player alternative costumes for the lead protagonists in the game. This has continued right up to the most recent release, and one new costume for Jill Valentine made the connection to the live-action films quite explicit. Available only in the 4v1 download Resident Evil Resistance, Jill's Retribution costume is straight out of Anderson's 5th Resident Evil film of the same name. Despite his version of Jill Valentine being in the film, Resistance Jill instead wears the black leather combo worn by Alice. The costume features the same metal belt-like connection she wears, albeit not on her front. Also, Alice doesn't wear sunglasses, but Jill is inherently cooler than Alice. The fact that the costume is called Retribution confirms the intent behind the costume. But this is not the only attire connection, oh no. We return once again to Outbreak. Whilst not a direct match, it's surely not a coincidence that a secret hidden costume of Alicia Ashcroft bears an uncanny resemblance to the famous red dress worn by Mila Jovovich in the first Resident Evil movie. Sharing a similar red colour, the dress can be unlocked by locating the SP items in the game. Believe it or not, there is a third attire connection, this time involving Claire Redfield. In the films, Claire is played by Ali Larter, a more gun-ho take on the famous Redfield sibling. Her outfit in Resident Evil Afterlife is very similar to the costume Claire would later wear in the canonical Resident Evil manga Heavenly Island. Perhaps a more obvious connection here to the films is the chapter name in Resident Evil Outbreak. This is called The Hive, and is set in Raccoon City General Hospital. This is because there is a leech infestation in the hospital, as opposed to anything related to the movies. Indeed, The Hive in the first Resident Evil film is a deep underground laboratory. The two locations should share absolutely no connection or similarities other than the use of its name. One of the key features of the Resident Evil movies has been the action melee, and this tradition started with the first film. Such moves did not go unnoticed by Capcom and have been replicated in their game. Mila Jovovich's famous neck-breaker move, as shown here, was recreated exactly by Jill Valentine in Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. A similar move was then pulled off in Umbrella Chronicles' sequel The Darkside Chronicles, but this time by Super Sleuth Ada Wong. Here we can see her dispatching a zombie dog in a very similar manner to how Alice did it in the first Resident Evil movie. Acting as a sort of visual representation of the live action's Umbrella Corporation, the Red and White Queen have been depicted as an intelligent AI, usually in the form of a little girl. But whilst the holographic element has not been replicated in the games to date, the idea of a Red and White Queen has. In Umbrella Chronicles, the Red Queen system controls the UMF-13, Umbrella's vast database that Sergei Vladimir successfully removes from Raccoon City to keep Umbrella afloat. Now, the White Queen has not been documented, but appears in visuals also within the same game. The idea, therefore, that the Red Queen is a supercomputer is one that Capcom thought was a good idea and duly snatched. The Nemesis, probably the most famous BOW of them all and one of the most terrifying. It was not a surprise that Paul W.S. Anderson would incorporate the Nemesis into his universe at some point, considering his popularity. Whilst the origins of the Nemesis in both universes are vastly different, and on the whole the movie version of his BOW is derided, elements of his characterization has crept into the franchise. Firstly, his weaponry. In Resident Evil 3, Nemesis makes use of a rocket launcher. In the movie, he also has access to a minigun. The minigun was added as a weapon for the Nemesis in Operation Raccoon City, thus mimicking the on-screen version. Equally, in Operation Raccoon City, and latterly in Resident Evil Remake 3, we see evidence of this weapon drop by Umbrella, something that was never present in the original Resident Evil 3 game. And finally, another feature of Anderson's Nemesis was the use of a head-up display. In the movie, Umbrella could watch as he took out the stars, akin to a first-person shooter. This view and HUD was also placed in Operation Raccoon City when the Nemesis was in combat. The main viral agent in both the games and the movies, and without doubt one of the most iconic elements to emanate from the Resident Evil movies, the look of the T-virus. They did get the colour wrong in the live-action versions, but the double helix samples were certainly striking and have become synonymous with the franchise. This look has been directly used by Slant 6 when developing Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City, but blink and you'll miss it. If you look very carefully during the retelling of the viral spill in Raccoon City, you can see that double helix being used. Sticking with Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, the entirety of the Caucasus laboratory in Russia is basically a homage to the live-action films. And one of the key aspects here is the schematics. An absolute mainstay of many Resident Evil films, Paul Anderson likes to use CGI schematics of the Hive and other locations to direct the audience to different parts of the laboratory. In Umbrella Chronicles, this was replicated again near shot for shot to schematics that were used in the first and third Resident Evil movie when Jill and Chris descended into darkness. Other elements from the Russian laboratory is the use of the train. Now this is quite an in-depth homage. Occurring at the same sort of time, Albert Wesker also infiltrates the facility, although from a nearby output which connected to the main laboratory via train. It is this train that is the connection here, taking inspiration from the first Resident Evil movie. Now I'm sure many of you will straight away point out that the train from the first Resident Evil movie, the Alexei 5000, is in itself a homage to the train Leon and Claire escaped Raccoon City in Resident Evil 2, the Galaxy 5000. This is 100% true, however, when playing the Dark Legacy chapter you really get the impression both internally and externally it had more in common with what we see in the film. And finally, perhaps the most famous thing to stem from the live-action movies has been the use of the laser corridor scene. It looks wonderful to this day. The clever use of the mirrors was an inspired choice effect-wise, and a good tool to kill off half the cast in one go. Believe it or not, however, this was not the first time a laser had been used in Resident Evil. In Resident Evil Survivor 2, there is a solitary laser in the final level of the Versus Roach mode. However, once the movie hit, Capcom couldn't resist upping the ante. Resident Evil 4 would see Leon go up against a wild laser corridor sequence to progress in his campaign, a scene that is still laughed at today. Also, and to an extent, the sun lasers from Resident Evil 5 are also semi-inspired. However, it's the return back to Umbrella Chronicles that the lasers are most prominent. Deep in the laboratories of Russia, Chris and Jill literally enter the world of the Anderson-verse by venturing down a corridor where we see the fabled lasers return almost shot for shot. It's clearly the most direct tie-in that could be made without making Alice a playable character, and what's worse is this sequence is entirely pointless as well. The end of the corridor is a complete dead end with a locked door, meaning that Jill and Chris have to return back exactly where they've come from. It's a completely pointless and purely manufactured nod to the Resident Evil movies. So there you have it, all the connections I could find from the Resident Evil movies that were later used in Resident Evil games. I hope you've enjoyed our quick little excursion down memory lane for the 6 original Resident Evil movies, and who knows what influences the new rebooted franchise will have on this series. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe and consider checking out our Patreon page.